त्यसको साथसाथै डाक्टर साइमन स्ट्रिकल्यान्ड उहाँले मेरो गाउँमा बसेर खेलान नर्थ ईस्ट अफ पोखरा उत्तर पश्चिम about 7 to 8 hours more from पोखरा पहिला त्यति लाग्थ्यो उहाँले 2 फेजमा त्यहाँ बसेर पच्यु लेभ्रीको विषयमा as well as legends myths etc त्यसमा चाहिँ उहाँको पहिला सुरुमा 18 महिना त्यसपछि followed by 9 महिना गरेर जम्मा 27 महिना बिताएर उहाँको थीसिस त्यहाँ लेख्नु भएको थियो त्यसैले चाहिँ साइमन इसवन हुआ दोस्रो खालदै थियो त ताले त्यो त्यो केपाल खाछ त्यो खाल उहाँले त्यहाँसिको अलिकति गुरुङको चाहिँ मेरो अलिक ठाडो खेलाङ्गे भाषाले ब्रस अलिकति रुट जस्तो सुन्छ माफ दिनुहोस् हाम्रो त्यस्तो स्ट्रेट फरवर्ड ल साइमन इसवन हुआ ताई जुन चाहिँ ताई लगेर भयो उहाँ
नमस्ते दाजुभाइ दिदीबहिनीहरू न lentai nasana ini nasa sakaimu unai sanda namesa shere nepalora ini tataji dia mi tan mo shamagere mi na ini sitoimo ani tu tamu pelu sang ke listo yori bishi ini sitoimo tajo na tamu ki banda ke mai english pomo Sataji, jadi nggak English boleh oh. So I'm going to say a little bit about the studies that I've made of the Pajumai Sharimai Pedagoda in Sikhisgaon and Kilangaon, Sikhisnasa, Kilangnasa. I learned a great deal from 2 men. Poju Padam Singh, Bhaji Poju, the late Padam Singh, and Bhaji Lauri Birbal. These 2 very wise men, very knowledgeable men, very kind men, taught me most of what I learned about the Pedagoda and the Tamu Sanskriti Dharma Rabharsa. So I shall say a little bit about what I think is the evidence about the past history of Tamil mind from my studies of the Pedagoda. And then I'll say a little bit about the present as far as I can understand. And then a little bit perhaps about what the future may hold. So if you study the Pedagoda, you would learn a lot about what the past history, the economy, and the society of Tamumai were like. I can think of some Pedagoda, like the Kusiyamape, which describes slash and burn agriculture, cutting down the woods, burning the wood, growing millet and harvesting millet. Hunting of deer in the Pada and in other Pedagoda. Salt trade, trading of grain for salt and other goods in Kumbichlene, Rundich, Lemai, Gumrach, Lemai, Chomorach, Lemai. And also pastoralism of yaks and sheep and cattle and other animals in the Planzich Lemai. And also, though, the very important subject of migration, the movement of people in the past. So in the Pojukorichlamaite and the Sharkakikriva, there is a very beautiful narrative about the migration. And there is archaeological relevance, as we know, from the interesting recent studies of Col Sombreyo, which you can see on the other side of the valley from Siklis Nasa to the north of Tangting. And the evidence from the archaeology there has indicated a settlement populated perhaps about 800 to 1,000 years ago. So we're talking about a long period of time in that area. There is also interesting evidence about the names in the Bedaluda. And one observation is that a name used in Bedaluda to refer to Tamumai is the name Se. There are 2 or 3 references to these in the Bedaluda I studied. One, Bomaseme, Ploasemaipe, and there are other references as well. And then, fourthly, if you look at the stories, the histories contained in the Bedaluda, and you study material of a similar kind from other parts of the region, there is quite a lot in common. And that's very important because some themes are very ancient. There is a theme in the story called Karada, about Karadare, which is about a returning husband, a husband who, if you like, gets lost and returns to his wife. And is helped in the process by an animal. And it's a story which you can find a little bit of a similar story to in the Nalapakela story in the Aranyaka Parva of the Mahabharata. But you can also find it in the stories of ancient Greece, in the epic of Homer's Odyssey. And you can find it in Slavic stories from Eastern Europe. And there are other important themes as well. And then the language of Tsongkwi, the language of the Bedaluda, is a deeply interesting language, in some respects showing variation in dialects from different parts of Tamumai area, but also quite possibly old language from the distant past. And then finally, a point about the style, the arrangement of the Shlokabag in the Bedaluda. Very elaborate, very complex, and extremely interesting. And if you look at the comparable material from the region between India and Western Europe, ancient evidence suggesting similar kinds of style dating back several thousand years. So I think there is a lot in the Bedaluda which indicates that it is very ancient. I thought if I could get the technology to work, I would play you a very short recording made in 1980. If it doesn't work, never mind, but if it does work, I'll say a little bit about it. So I wanted to play you that little example for 2 reasons. One is that it illustrates the very beautiful poetic language shown by the repetition of words like prom prom ya prom para ya prom, prom prom mi prom mado ya prom ya. And also because there are differences in the verb forms from vernacular, ordinary Tamu. So at the end you have Yadamaga for Yai. Yadamaga for Yai. You have Shoyekadze for Shonghai. Soyekadze, Songhai. So interesting verb differences. And then thirdly, if you think the first 4 Shlokapad were quite long, the second 4 Shlokapad were very short, and it's the shift in pace of recitation reflects the sudden change in the storyline. The storyline is that a bird flies up to the sky and brings back the sun, flies down to the underworld and brings back the moon. And because the bird has brought the moon and sun back, lo, everybody can see suddenly light comes back. It's a very beautiful example of just how special the language and the poetry of the Pedaluda exists. Now I'll say a little bit about my understanding of the present, and as I said, it's a long time since I was last in Nepal, but I will say a little bit about my understanding. And the first is the diversity of tradition between villages, because every village appears to have slightly different Pedaluda. If you talk to different Pojushiva, Cleritiva, you'll get a slightly different version of any particular Pedaluda you might be interested in. But secondly, it looks as if Poju are very clever, Cleori, very clever, at being able to recite very similar recitations over very long periods of time. I compared 2 recitations, 2 performances by Padam Singh, a year apart, and they were 99% identical. And these are very long recitations, several hundred shloka each of them. And then I compared a recitation of Plagulava by Padam Singh in Unaik Sunasi Sal, 1979, with a performance of the same by a pupil, Kul Prasad, in 1992. So over 13 years difference in the time. And these were about 60% the same. So very good evidence of continuity, I think, there. But then there are some other important points to make about the consistent importance of certain central acts. I'm thinking of Glawiwa during the Kwelawa, Hawawa at the end of the Kwelawa, when all the different kinds of relatives involved in the Kwelawa are mentioned and the importance of their participation acknowledged, and blessings for the good fortune in the future given. And there are also other points. One interesting characteristic of Pedaluda is that they refer to the geographical area in great detail. And I'll come on to a bit more about that in a moment. Also, sensitivity to the family and the social context, naming of the people who are involved, naming of the ancestors where that's required. And it's very impressive that a single distinguished Podyukjiva might know perhaps 13,000 Shlokapad. That's a very large quantity of material if you think about the amount of time and the amount of knowledge which that requires. But also, there is an element of dynamic creativity. One of our colleagues, Yarjung Tamu, has published quite recently a text of a Pedaluda in which I think there is some evidence of his creativity coming through. If you look at it, you might see what I mean by that. And that is surely something to be impressed by if what you're interested in is ensuring a degree of flexibility and continuity in the tradition. But there is also evidence of vulnerability, and my guru, Alan McFarlane, has written a little bit about this, referring to Bosol Nasa and the difficulty of the Poju tradition in that village. So there is some expertise which is probably being lost. And the question, the challenge for us all is how to avoid losing that expertise. I said a little bit about the geographical areas and the places named, and this is a map showing the Siklis village here. The village is visited by Karamarin in the Karata story in the Moshelava of the Puritan. When Karamarin goes with his 9 sons to look for wild honey, he travels through all these villages, and in each place he points out where there is honey to find. And in that recitation, Karamarin himself goes to harvest the honey, and I'll play you this little bit as well. Okay, so like the previous example, this illustrates the language of Sangh, the verb form nidamaga, rather than what you might use in contemporary Tamu, yawa or yagi. And then the process of stepping down the ladder as he climbs down the cliff. It's a wonderfully evocative way of describing the step-by-step process of climbing down the ladder. And similarly, the process when he cuts into the honeycomb, a very wonderful way of expressing the process of harvesting the honey in this case. And these photographs were taken in a valley between Kilang and Siklis village. And then finally another map. This is a map showing the journey, if you like, taken when at the end of the Karada story, Karamarin expels his evil-doing sons, and he expels them along this route, starting at the north, coming down the Marsiangi Kola, and then travelling to the west, expelling them over in the westerly direction. And my purpose in showing you this map is again to show just how tightly related the Pedaluda are to the geography of the locality and to the history, because you'll recognise that Kol Sangre is somewhere up here, and that is, if you like, in the heart of the area historically occupied, inhabited by Tamu. So my last slide is about the future. It was a wise man who said, of course, it's very difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. But it is important, and the Tamu Sangh and the Tamu Dhee UK recognise this very important need to record, to translate, to understand Pedaluda. And it's not just, if you like, for us, but it's for generations to come. But there is also surely a need to recognise that in reality, Bojamai Llywelyn work in a market to a degree where they compete with alternative offers. And that is something that needs to be, I think, much better understood perhaps than it is at the moment. And then finally, the point that Pedaluda are an important part of Tamu identity. When I met our friend Ganesh Manugurung, who visited this country a couple of months ago, he pointed to a CD I had of Pedaluda. He said, "This is our identity." And we need to understand and to cultivate that. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all I really had to say. So if there are any questions, I will do my best to answer.